We welcome you to our continuing discussion of the Book of Mormon. I'm Victor L. Ludlow, a professor of ancient scripture at Brigham Young University, and I have three colleagues with me today as we're about ready to discuss some of the important chapters of Jacob. To my immediate left is Charles Swift, and next to him is Frank Judd, and on the opposite end is a young professor by the name of Judd Ludlow that I've known for a few years. Welcome. We're glad to have you here with us as we discuss these chapters of Jacob 4 through 6. Jacob, of course, being that son born in the wilderness and one who becomes the successor prophet, as it were, to Nephi. These chapters 4 to 6, what can we anticipate here, Frank?
Well, just briefly, as an overview, in Jacob chapter 4, Jacob mentions the law of Moses. In particular, he mentions how the Nephites correctly understood the intent of the law of Moses, and how many of their Jewish brethren from the old world misunderstood the law of Moses. And he uses that as a backdrop to prepare them for chapter 5, which is Zenos's allegory of the olive tree. I think that it's interesting at the end of chapter 4 that Jacob mentions the reason why he is including chapter 5, which, as we know, is the longest chapter in the Book of Mormon. We know that Zenos was a prophet. We know that his writings were included on the brass plates. In 1 Nephi chapter 13, Nephi was told that the brass plates contained basically the same information as our current Bible, except that they had more of the prophecies of the holy prophets, and Zenos's prophecy was among them. And so it sets the stage by letting us know that Zenos was one of those great prophets that was included in the brass plates, but not the record of the Jews as we understood it.
So Zenos has been quoted a little bit earlier, like in chapter 19 in 1 Nephi. Not near as much, of course, as Isaiah from the brass plates, but probably, I guess, would we agree, next to Isaiah, probably the most quoted from the brass plates, even more than, say, someone like a Jeremiah, who is a very major prophet, and a lot of his works would have been on those brass plates. But apparently, particularly for the theme of these Book of Mormon prophets, Zenos seems to have been a valuable resource for them.
Absolutely.
And I wish we knew more about him, obviously, but we do learn a little bit later in Helaman that he did seal his testimony with his life, so he was another prophet who became a martyr for his teachings and his belief.
Yeah, we don't even know what century he lived in. We don't know whether he was in that century or more from the time of Isaiah down to Lehi, or if he even preceded Isaiah. Obviously a significant prophet, and one that helps us understand some important things about the house of Israel. I think part of the purpose of these different works are to help us understand these different prophetic perspectives. Charles, could you read verse 8 there in Jacob 4?
Sure.
And let's just see how this sort of sets the stage for some of this.
Behold, great and marvelous are the works of the Lord. How unsearchable are the depths of the mysteries of him. And it is impossible that man should find out all his ways. And no man knoweth of his ways, save it be revealed unto him. Wherefore, brethren, despise not the revelations of God.
All right, so despise not the revelations of God. We can't really fathom. And what other insights do we get here that Jacob is just sort of setting us up for this allegory that's going to outline this scattering, gathering of Israel, a process that's going to encompass thousands of years? And how could one have ever assumed or predicted this type of an event. We can't begin to fathom the mind of God. We're told that from the beginning. What other insights are we getting from this 4th chapter?
I think one thing we see, just going a couple more verses in verse 10, this idea of, wherefore, brethren, seek not to counsel the Lord, but to take counsel from his hand. For behold, ye yourselves know that he counseleth in wisdom and in justice and in great mercy over all his works. And I think, at least indirectly, this leads us to Zenos's allegory, with the idea of, I'm going to present this allegory to you, and it's for you to take counsel from, for you to learn from, and not make the mistakes that predecessors have made.
And verse 11 also continues another, I think, preparatory step to the allegory, talking about how we must be reconciled unto him, God, through the atonement of Christ, his only begotten Son. And, one of the struggles that the Jews had during the time of Lehi was their rejection of some of these prophecies and so forth. And they're, maybe seeking to counsel the Lord rather than receive counsel from him. And so that's kind of what Jacob is trying to address, is how the need to be reconciled unto Christ, that he needs to be the center of their focus and their worship.
In verse 14, it also mentions something similar to that, where it talks about many of those Jews who were looking beyond the mark. And Elder Maxwell once said that the mark is Jesus Christ. And apparently there were those who were missing the most significant part of the Old Testament, and that is restored through the writings of Zenos, which focuses on how the whole plan was to focus on the gospel of Jesus Christ and to bring people into the covenant. So that's an important setting for chapter 5 as well.
So, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think it's important in that verse that Frank referred to, this idea of they sought for things that they could not understand. And to me, that's an amazing insight. That instead of focusing on the Savior and focusing on that mark, they tried to find things that they couldn't understand. And it ended up being fruitless for them.
And then he summarizes it, as it were, in verse 18, Behold, my beloved brethren, I will unfold this mystery unto you. If I do not by any means get shaken from my firmness in the Spirit and stumble because of my over-anxiety for you. He's really anxious. He really wants to present something of great value to them, and he doesn't want to, turn them away from this message that he's about to deliver. Well, let's turn to chapter 5 and talk about this rather significant chapter. I mean, those who have read the Book of Mormon a number of times, this is undoubtedly one of the chapters that they identify with. And not just because it's the longest of all the chapters in the Book of Mormon. What's an allegory? I mean, it's called an allegory of Zenos. At least that's the term that we use it, and that's the term that's there in the chapter heading. Is that just a simple parable? What kind of a literary form is it? You're involved in literature here, Charles. What is an allegory?
Well, I think we do have some examples of where parables are allegories, but it's not every parable is an allegory. And I think maybe the simplest way to understand it is an allegory is an extended metaphor where each of the elements signifies something else. So you may have a parable that has several elements in it, but not each one of them is symbolic of something outside of itself. But with an allegory, you've got this narrative that's an extended metaphor, and each element, the tree, the servant, every single element is a symbol of something else, and it has a unifying theme.
So it's very symbolic. You can take this item and connect it here, and this item and connect it, and so it just becomes more and more complex, I guess, the longer these metaphors are drawn out and the different stages are discussed there.
Exactly. And I think also one of the great things about it is you can learn more from it. In a way, it becomes more complex, and in a way, it's very simple.
Now, would this make it easier or harder for an ancient audience where the average person probably wouldn't have had a written copy of it? Is this something that would make it easier for them to kind of share with their families and discuss it among themselves?
I would think so, because it's a story that's said in a form that they're familiar with in terms of planting and grafting, and also that it's a story. So it's much easier to remember.
And so even though it's a long one, they're familiar enough with agricultural cycles that they could carry it and see it through its ins and outs. And I mean, because it seems to be some repeated patterns. He's almost ready to give up on the tree, and then, well, let's go give up on it. No, let's keep working on it one more time and one more time.
And then you can imagine that when they go out and work in such a situation, that these symbols just come alive because they see the olive trees, they work with them and so forth, and so that reminds them of this story even further, and they're even maybe doing some of the things that the allegory discusses.
So even if they're using, apple or other kinds of trees, and might not have exactly the same culture that Zenos and Isaiah and Lehi and all were originally raised in, still it's a universal enough kind of a cycle that they could relate to it. All right, well, let's see if we can identify then. It's the sayings of the prophet Zenos, which he spake unto the house of Israel. But it's not just unto the house of Israel, it's going to be about the house of Israel. And he likens the house of Israel here in verse 3 to a tame olive tree which a man took and nourished in his vineyard. It grew old, waxed old, began to decay. What do we know about olive trees and kind of the basic cycle there? Why use the olive tree? Why not, say, a fig tree or a pine tree or something else?
I think part of it is just where Zenos, came from. Olive tree was, predominant in the Mediterranean area, and I think also the work that you do with an olive tree kind of perpetuates the olive tree. So you can take branches away from it and plant it in another tree, graft it, and it can grow off of this new tree, and likewise you can bring others, and so it just fits very well with how Heavenly Father has this plan, and Christ and the prophets work within this vineyard to bring about his covenant promises to the house of Israel.
It's fascinating to me. A few years ago I decided to learn a little bit more about olive trees, having never had any in the backyard here in Utah Valley or anything like that, but having seen them often in my visits to the Holy Land. And I was just amazed at how sophisticated olive tree culture is in the whole Mediterranean region. I mean, from Spain and North Africa all the way across into the Middle East. And there are connoisseurs of olive oil who can actually taste and tell you this is from Italy, or this is from Spain, or this is from North Africa, or this is from Israel or Syria or places like that. I mean, those that really know it, it's a very sophisticated agricultural productivity in that whole region. And I don't know how much of a horticulturalist or whatever Zenos was, but those that do love agriculture would surely identify with some of this olive tree culture.
Well, I'm sorry.
Another element to point out here is that this whole allegory mentions olive trees in a vineyard, which to our ears may sound a bit strange because we would expect grapevines to be in the vineyard, but in the Mediterranean it is common to have olive trees scattered throughout grape vineyards. And there are a number of reasons for that, but it just shows the context from which Zenos is coming. It may sound strange to our ears, but it would be it would fit perfectly well within the context of the Mediterranean.
That's a good point. And I also wonder too if it's not partially a symbolic reason, the value that Israel placed on the olive and what they used olive oil for like
anointings,
or for light,
and coronation ceremonies.
Exactly. So it's a practical fruit that they use, but it's also very symbolic and very important to them.
And we could even take that symbolism into the New Testament, a garden press, a Gethsemane, exactly. On a mount of olive trees and so forth as a part of this. And of course that's one of the major figures here is the Lord of the vineyard, and the willingness he is for it. All right, so we have this master of the vineyard in verse 4, noticing that his olive tree has begun to decay. He's going to prune it and dig around it and give it one more chance. And so it started to respond, but the main part of it, verse 6, begins to fade. This seems to be kind of talking like after the Israelites were brought out of captivity in Egypt, and there was a promising start, but it didn't really mature into this nice spiritual kingdom like the Father wanted, and so there needed to be a little bit of pruning, and some of this pruning will be to take some of Israel from their original ancestral land of inheritance and start to scatter them out. And starting in verse 7, I think we begin to see this scattering of Israel. Now we could have, discuss it, I guess, theologically. They've broken their covenant. They're no longer keeping the commandments. They've been promised a land. They've broken the promise. So the Lord is punishing them by sending them out. But there may be some other reasons as well. What do we learn about the scattering here in these next number of verses?
I think part of what we learn is just that they are being taken to different parts of the vineyard, which represents, the world, and some are going to start to thrive in these new areas and produce. Others are going to kind of be half as fruitful, not quite as good. And so at first it really is a positive thing to kind of scatter them to strengthen these branches that are put into new areas. But there's this one transplant that needs a little bit more pruning and digging and nourishing, and that kind of starts in verse 15, where he comes back and he looks at the different trees and sees that in some cases it's done well, but in other cases it's not working. And a lot of people attribute, starting in verse 25, to maybe some of the branches of Israel that were brought to the Americas, and where you had groups that were producing well, like the righteous Nephites, and others that weren't. And so there in verse 25 it says that only a part of the tree hath brought forth tame fruit, and the other part of the tree hath brought forth wild fruit. And so could be talking about the Lamanites and Nephites there.
Okay, so he's still cultivating the mother tree. There's still some of Israel, much of Israel, that would stay there. In fact, through the millennia, whether they were Samaritans or some small Jewish communities that remained there, the mother tree, the homeland, the ancestral homeland, some Israelites stayed there. Excuse me. But starting in verse 20 through verse 25 that you mentioned there, Jared, he talks about at least 4 different areas. In verse 20, he takes his servant out with him and says, now look here, here's the first place that has brought forth some fruit, and it's good fruit, and let's take some of this and harvest it, and I've nourished it. And then the servant says to his master, well, how come you planted the tree here? It's the poorest spot in the land of the vineyard. Now, we're told earlier he transplanted into the nethermost, the furthest most parts of the vineyard. And from the Middle East, of course, that Israel could scatter all the way through Asia, all the way into and through Europe, all the way through Africa. It really could be spread all over the place. And then if they start moving by ship, why, of course, then the whole world is a possibility for them to settle. But as poor as that first spot was, and the servant thinking, oh, this is the poorest spot in the vineyard, starting in verse 23, he introduces another planting, and he says, now, take a look at it. This is even poorer than the first place, but notice I've nourished it here, and it's brought forth much fruit. Let's gather that. And then in verse 24, now look here, here's another branch also. And I planted it and nourished it, and it has brought forth fruit. Now, he doesn't say whether it's good or bad or or somewhere in between. Maybe it's just sort of in between, because if they're bad, they seem to be marked. Or in verse 25, if it's really good land, it's mentioned. But ironically, the one that's in the really good land, as you mentioned, Jared, that's where it's not just all good. There's some bad. It's kind of like half and half. And so I think that's why we assume this is probably the part of the vineyard referring to our Book of Mormon community, with the classic Nephite, Lamanite sort of division.
With respect to some of these other transplantings, I think it might be interesting to note that there's evidence in our own biblical account of some of these Israelites who have been scattered elsewhere and are bringing forth good fruit. There are wonderful stories, for example, with the book of Daniel or with Ezekiel of those who are of the house of Israel, but they are not living in the Holy Land, but rather in Babylon or other places, but they are doing well, and they are bringing forth good fruit.
So not being able to, at least to my satisfaction, identify now which one of these is which group of Israel. It's interesting, we do have basically 4 major groups of Israel that scatter over the ages. The first that were to scatter were what we call the lost tribes, or the 10 tribes, but actually even preceding them in the years before, the Assyrians had started to take many inhabitants of the northern kingdom of Israel and distribute them throughout her Assyrian empire. And then as Israel was destroyed, 722, 721, why then there was that mass group they took and resettled. They didn't like living in Assyria. They fled northward and become what we call the lost 10 tribes. But we need to remember the Assyrians also brought others into the homeland. They intermarried with those that remained behind, and those we call the Samaritans. And there were some in the north that as Assyria was attacking, they fled southward. Hezekiah had to build new villages and towns to inhabit all these northern Israelite refugees. And that's probably where Lehi and Ishmael and their families, because they're from the northern tribes, but they're living in the southern kingdom near Jerusalem a century later. And so that's the first group. And then the next group would be, of course, the community we're studying here in our discussion, the Book of Mormon community, both the Lehite community, and unbeknownst to them at this time, there's actually another group of Jewish refugees in this land that they haven't yet met up with, that we'll get to in a later discussion session. And then there were the Jews themselves. We talked about going to Babylon, Daniel, Ezekiel, and others that are there. And then from these groups, they start to scatter all over the world.
Well, and I think, too, one thing that's important, because it certainly does correspond with history, and it certainly does help us see how the Lord interacted with the house of Israel. But if I can go back for just a little bit, in Jacob 4:17, it says, "And now, my beloved, how is it possible that these, after having rejected the sure foundation, can ever build upon it, that it may become the head of their corner?" So we have this allegory that corresponds with history, but it also corresponds with us and our personal lives. And so I can picture someone reading this allegory and asking that same question: how can my son or how can my daughter, who has rejected the gospel, ever come back? And you have that analogy going throughout. And I think part of the message is the Lord will keep working with your son or daughter. Verse 22 of Jacob 5, when, as you mentioned, the servant said, "Well, why did you plant it in such poor ground?" Or the parent says, "How could you let this happen to my child?" And the Lord's response in 22, "Counsel me not. I know what I'm doing with your children. Have faith. Work with me with this." So I love the fact that it does both correspond with historical events and teaches us how we can have hope for our loved ones.
Very good. Well, and speaking of hope, starting now in verse 29, there seems to be a period of dark ages where all parts of the vineyard seem to fall into wickedness, I guess would say, no longer bearing good fruit, and apostasy coming. Talking about the frustration that they have, these workers in the vineyard, with not being able to have it produce much.
Can I mention one thing about that?
Sure.
Very briefly. In verse 31, it talks about the fruit, that there was much fruit that did cumber the tree. And in verse 30, it said all sorts of fruit did cumber the tree. I think it's important to make a distinction between the branches and the fruit. We understand about the apostasy that there was doctrinal corruption and that there was a loss of priesthood authority, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all the branches, all the people were evil during that period. There were wonderful people who understood enough about Christ to continue to love Him and try to serve Him. But if you don't have the priesthood authority, and if you don't have a pristine doctrinal basis, you're not going to bring forth the right kind of fruit either. So I think it's an important clarification for us to understand that there were good people throughout the Middle Ages during the apostasy, but the fruit that they brought forth was not as good as it could have been.
Okay. Okay. Well, starting in verse 55, we get some of the blessings of the restoration, where one final attempt is made, and finally it looks like success is starting to come, and growth and proper development is happening. Verse 72 is probably about right where we are right now in this allegory. We're still waiting for the grand harvest, the millennial reign and all of that. And then that's coming and talked about when there will be this long season of this marvelous bringing in a harvest yet to come. What do we learn from this whole allegory here?
Well, I kind of like in chapter 6, right after when Jacob starts talking about this, verse 4, he talks about how merciful is our God unto us, for he remembereth the house of Israel, both roots and branches, and he stretches forth his hands unto them all the day long. And I think that's the great hope and promise of this allegory, is that God is there. He's merciful. He will remember the house of Israel. He will stretch forth his hands all the day long. And that's as applicable to us as it was to the Nephites, as it was to the Jews, and so forth.
It's hard for us to fathom, but he does it, and we learn from it, and we can help our families learn from it. Thank you. That was a helpful discussion. Thank you.